The scream came from the east tower, and by the time Elira reached the top of the stairs, her candle had already burned down to a stub. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall, heart pounding, and listened. There was no scream now, only two men speaking in low voices behind a half-open door. She should have walked away. She had a whole floor left to clean before dawn, and if the head housekeeper found her standing idle in a dark hallway, there would be trouble. But something about the tone of those voices made her feet stay rooted to the spot. They were not the voices of guards on watch. They were careful, quiet, the kind of voices people use when they do not want to be heard. "The wine will be delivered on the night of the gathering," one man said. "No one will taste anything wrong until it is far too late. And the king will drink first, as he always does, to honor his guests," the second voice answered. "By morning, the throne will be empty." Elira's blood turned to ice. She did not move. She did not breathe. The candle in her hand trembled, and hot wax dripped onto her fingers, but she barely felt it. She was thinking only of the Alpha King, Draven Ashborn, a man she had seen exactly 3 times in her 2 years working in this fortress, always from a distance, always surrounded by guards and nobles who never looked her way. A floorboard creaked beneath her foot. The voices stopped. Elira did not wait to see what would happen next. She turned and ran, her soft shoes silent on the stone, her candle snuffed out by the wind of her own movement. She took the servants' staircase 2 steps at a time, not stopping until she reached the safety of the kitchen, where the fire in the hearth still glowed with the last embers of the evening meal. She leaned against the wall and pressed a hand to her chest, trying to slow her breathing. She had heard something she was never meant to hear, and now she did not know what to do with it. Elira had come to the fortress of the Ashbourne Pack 2 years earlier, after her family's small farm on the northern border had been lost to a harsh winter and worse debts. She was not a wolf herself, only human, which meant she would never rise above the position of maid no matter how many years she served. The wolves who ran this place did not think of humans as equals. They were useful hands, quiet servants, nothing more. Elira had learned early on that the safest way to survive in a place like this was to be invisible. Do the work, say nothing, ask no questions, attract no attention. But invisibility had its price. It meant that when she tried to speak, no one expected her words to matter. She spent the rest of that night unable to sleep, turning the conversation over and over in her mind. The gathering, the wine, the king drinking first. She did not know exactly what gathering they meant, but she knew there was only one event grand enough to fit those words. The Alpha Summit, held once every few years, where leaders of all the neighboring packs came together under one roof to settle disputes and renew old alliances. It was less than 3 weeks away. The entire fortress had been buzzing with preparations for days, extra guards posted at the gates, extra staff brought in from the villages to help with the cooking and the cleaning. If someone meant to hurt the king during the summit, in front of every rival pack leader in the region, it would not only be a tragedy. It would be a spark thrown into dry grass. Packs that had only just begun to trust one another again after years of conflict would blame each other. War could follow, and no one would even suspect that the true danger had come from someone inside these very walls. Elira knew she had to tell someone. The question was who. The next morning, she chose Beta Corwin, the king's second in command, a broad-shouldered wolf with graying hair at his temples who was known for being fair, if a little short-tempered. She waited outside the training yard until he finished sparring with 2 younger guards, then approached him, with her head bowed, the way she had been taught. "Beta Corwin, sir. May I speak with you? It is important." He barely glanced at her. "Make it quick, girl. I have little time." She told him everything, word for word, as carefully as she could remember it. The dark hallway, the 2 voices, the wine, the gathering, the king drinking first. Corwin's expression did not change the way she had hoped it would. Instead of alarm, she saw something closer to impatience. "You were sneaking around in the East Tower at night, and you heard 2 men whispering, and now you believe there is a plot against the Alpha King's life," he said slowly, as if repeating her own words back to her would somehow reveal how foolish they sounded. "Did you see their faces?" "No, sir. It was dark, and I did not want to be caught." "Did you recognize their voices?" "No, sir. I am sorry. I only heard what they said." Corwin sighed. The kind of sigh a man gives when he has already decided the conversation is over. Maids hear all sorts of things in the halls at night. Half of it is servants' gossip, and the other half is nothing at all. I have a summit to prepare for, and I do not have time to chase shadows based on the word of a girl who cannot even name who she overheard. He turned to walk away, then paused, and added, not unkindly but not gently either, go back to your work, and keep this kind of talk to yourself. Rumors about the king's safety are the last thing we need before the summit. Elira stood there long after he had gone, feeling the sting of dismissal settle into her chest. She told herself it did not matter, that she had done what she could, that the responsibility was no longer hers to carry. But as she walked back toward the servants' quarters, she could not shake the feeling that something terrible was coming, and that she was the only person who knew it. Word of her strange claim spread faster than she expected. By that evening, the other maids were already whispering about it in the washroom, some with amusement, others with concern for her. They say you told Beta Corwin the king is going to be poisoned, said Nora, a thin girl a year younger than Elira, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. I did not say poisoned exactly, Elira murmured, scrubbing a pot harder than it needed. I only told him what I heard. You should be careful, said an older woman named Ellen, who had worked in the fortress for nearly 20 years, and had seen more than her share of servants come and go. The wolves do not like humans who cause trouble, even humans who mean well. If word reaches the wrong ears, that you are spreading tales about danger to the king, you could lose more than your position here. Elira knew Ellen meant it, as a warning of kindness, not cruelty, but it did nothing to ease the knot in her stomach. She spent the following days trying to push the memory of that night aside, focusing on her work, scrubbing floors, folding linens, carrying trays up and down the endless stone stairs. But every time she passed the East Tower, her eyes were drawn to that same dark hallway, and every time she heard two men speaking quietly together, anywhere in the fortress, her whole body went tense. She tried once more, 3 days later, approaching one of the gate guards, a younger man named Owen who she thought might be more willing to listen than Corwin had been. He listened politely enough, but by the end of her story, she could see the same doubt in his eyes. I will mention it to someone, he said, though his tone suggested he had no real intention of doing so. But truly, miss, plots like that only happen in stories. No one would dare move against the Alpha King inside his own fortress. The punishment for such a thing would be more than any wolf could survive. Elira wanted to believe him. She wanted, more than anything, to believe that she had simply misheard, that the words in that dark hallway had meant something entirely different, something harmless. But the memory of those two voices was too clear, too deliberate, to be explained away so easily. It was nearly a week after that first night, when fate placed her directly in the king's path. She had been assigned, along with 2 other maids, to clean the private study on the 3rd floor, a room she had never been inside before, reserved usually for the king's most trusted advisors. She was told the king himself would be away that afternoon, meeting with envoys from a neighboring territory, and the room would be empty until evening. She was wrong. Elira was halfway through dusting a tall shelf of old leather-bound books when the door opened without warning, and Alpha King Draven Ashbourne stepped inside. She froze completely, the cloth still in her hand, her heart slamming against her ribs. He was taller than she remembered from her distant glimpses of him, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell just past his collar, and eyes the color of a stormy sea, sharp and unreadable. He carried himself the way all wolves of high rank did, with a quiet, effortless authority that filled the room the moment he entered it. I did not realize anyone would be in here, he said, his voice low and even. Forgive me, my lord. I was told the room would be empty. I will leave at once. Elira dropped into a hurried bow, already moving toward the door, her cloth clutched tightly in her hand. Wait. She stopped, startled, her eyes lifting briefly to meet his, before dropping again out of habit. It was not common for someone of his rank to ask a maid to wait. Usually, they were simply ignored, as if invisible. You are the maid who went to Beta Corwin, Draven said. It was not a question. Elira's stomach dropped. Yes, my lord. He mentioned it to me. Something about a plot involving poisoned wine at the summit. His tone was difficult to read, neither mocking nor entirely serious, simply curious. He seemed to think it was nothing but a servant's overactive imagination. I understand why he would think that, my lord, Elira said carefully, choosing her words the way she might choose her steps across thin ice. I have no proof. I only have what I heard with my own ears, and I know that is not enough for anyone to act upon. And yet you kept trying to warn people, even after you were told to stop. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze sharp enough that she felt as though he could see straight through the careful mask of humility she had learned to wear. Most servants would have let the matter drop the first time they were dismissed. I could not, my lord. If I am wrong, then I have only wasted a little of people's patience. But if I am right, and I said nothing, and something terrible happened to you at the summit, because I was too afraid to keep speaking. She trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought, without sounding as though she were accusing him of something. I would not be able to live with that, my lord. Something shifted in his expression, subtle, but unmistakable. A flicker of genuine interest replacing the careful neutrality he had worn since entering the room. What is your name? Elira, my lord. Elira Voss. Tell me exactly what you heard, Elira Voss. Every word, in order, and leave nothing out, because you fear it, sounds foolish. For the second time in a week, Elira told her story, but this time, the person listening did not interrupt with impatience, or dismiss her with a sigh. Draven listened in complete silence, his sharp eyes fixed on her face the entire time, and when she finished, he did not immediately respond. He walked slowly to the window, looking out over the courtyard below, his hands clasped behind his back. I do not believe you are lying, he said finally. But I also cannot act on the word of two unnamed voices in a dark hallway, not without more. I understand, my lord. That does not mean I will ignore it. He turned back to face her, and for a brief moment, something almost like respect passed across his features. Keep your eyes open, Elira Voss. If you notice anything else out of place, anything at all, bring it to me directly. Not to Corwin, not to the guards, to me. Elira blinked, startled by the request. Directly to you, my lord. I would not be permitted near your private chambers without. I will see to it that you are. He said it simply, as though it were the easiest thing in the world, though Elira knew it was anything but. A maid granted direct access to the Alpha King was almost unheard of. You notice something everyone else missed. That is worth more to me than 100 guards standing watch at the gate who see nothing at all. He left the room without another word, his footsteps fading down the corridor, and Elira stood alone among the tall bookshelves, her heart still racing, though for an entirely different reason now. She did not know whether to feel relieved that someone finally believed her, or terrified by the weight of what he had just asked of her. Whatever came next, she understood one thing with complete certainty. She could no longer walk away from this. The threat against the king was real. She was sure of it in her bones, and now, whether she wanted it or not, she had become part of stopping it. That night, as she lay awake in the small room she shared with two other maids, listening to their steady breathing in the dark, Elira thought about the two voices in the East Tower hallway, about the wine that would be delivered on the night of the gathering, about the king who would drink first to honor his guests. Somewhere in this fortress, someone was quietly building toward the destruction of everything the Ashbourne pack had worked to protect, and only a handful of people even knew to be afraid. She closed her eyes, but sleep would not come easily. 3 weeks remained until the summit. 3 weeks to find proof of a plot that existed only in fragments of overheard conversation and the sound of careful, dangerous voices in the dark. It was not much time. But it was, she told herself, enough. It would have to be. Elira did not sleep well after that night in the study. She kept turning the king's words over in her mind, the careful weight of his voice when he told her to come to him directly. It felt like both a gift and a burden, and she was not entirely certain which one outweighed the other. The following morning, a folded note arrived for her, delivered quietly by a guard she did not recognize, a young man with sandy hair, named Alden, who said nothing beyond handing it to her and walking away. Inside, written in a firm, slanted hand, were simple instructions. She was to report any unusual activity to Alden directly, and he would carry word to the king without drawing attention. It was a small kindness, she realized, a way of protecting her from the suspicion that would fall on a maid seen entering the king's private chambers too often. She kept the note hidden in the folds of her apron and went about her work with new purpose. If no one else would search for the truth, she would search for it herself. carefully, quietly, the way she had learned to do everything in this fortress. Her first discovery came almost by accident. While delivering fresh linens to the record room, where the fortress steward kept ledgers of deliveries and payments, she noticed one of the younger clerks hurriedly closing a large leather book the moment she entered, as though he did not want her to see what was written inside. It might have meant nothing. Clerks were often protective of their work, but something about the quickness of his movement, the flicker of nervousness in his eyes, stayed with her long after she left the room. She mentioned it to Alden that evening, expecting him to dismiss it, as she had been dismissed so many times before. Instead, he listened carefully and promised to look into which ledger the clerk had been guarding. 2 days later, Alden found her in the kitchen garden, where she had gone to gather herbs for the evening meal, and told her what he had learned. The ledger in question recorded deliveries of wine and other goods brought in for the summit. Several entries had been altered, dates changed, quantities adjusted, in a hand that did not match the steward's usual careful script. "Someone is changing the delivery records," Elira said slowly, feeling a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. Why would anyone need to do that unless they wanted to hide something moving in or out of the fortress without being noticed? "That is exactly what the king wondered when I told him," Alden said. "He wants you to keep watching that clerk, quietly, without letting him know he is being observed." Elira agreed, though the idea of spying on someone within her own fortress made her uneasy. Still, she understood the necessity of it. If the plot was real, and every piece of evidence she uncovered made her more certain that it was, then caution had to come before comfort. Over the following days, she found small reasons to pass by the record room more often than usual, offering to deliver messages or fresh candles, anything that would let her observe without suspicion. She learned that the clerk, a quiet man named Peter with nervous hands and tired eyes, met with a stranger near the wine cellar entrance twice, always after dark, always for only a few minutes at a time. She could not see the stranger's face clearly in the dim light, but she noted the fine cut of his cloak, far too well made for an ordinary merchant or servant. She reported everything to Alden, who reported it to the king. Slowly, a picture began to form, though its edges remained frustratingly blurred. Someone with access to fine clothing and enough authority to move freely through the fortress at night was working with a nervous clerk to alter shipment records tied to the summit's wine supply. It was not proof of poison. It was not a name or a face she could point to with certainty. But it was more than anyone else in the fortress had managed to uncover, and it confirmed that the danger she had overheard in the East Tower was not the product of her imagination. The king summoned her again, this time more openly, though still with care taken to avoid drawing attention. She was brought to his study in the late evening, after most of the fortress had settled into quiet, and found him standing by the same window where she had first spoken to him, a map of the fortress grounds spread across the table before him. "You have done more in a week than my own guards managed in years of quiet peace," he said, without turning from the window. "I underestimated how sharp your eyes are, Elira Voss. I only noticed what seemed strange to me, my lord. I do not know if it is truly connected to what I overheard." "It is connected." He finally turned to face her, and the tension in his expression told her he was taking this far more seriously than he had allowed himself to show before. A clerk, altering delivery records tied to Summit wine, meeting secretly with someone of clear noble bearing. That is not coincidence. That is the shape of a conspiracy beginning to show itself. Elira felt a strange mixture of relief and fear settle over her. Relief, because she was no longer alone in believing the danger was real. Fear, because believing it meant admitting that someone close to the throne, someone with wealth and standing, was willing to see the king destroyed. "Do you have any guess who the stranger might be, my lord?" Draven was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight. "I have suspicions, but suspicion is not proof, and if I move against someone of high standing without certainty, I risk tearing this fortress apart from within, long before any outside enemy has the chance to do it for me. I need more than shadows and altered ledgers, Elira. I need something undeniable." "Then I will find it," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his stormy eyes. "You do not have to carry this burden alone. I could assign guards to investigate more directly." "With respect, my lord, guards are noticed. A maid moving quietly through the halls, dusting shelves and carrying linens, is not." She met his gaze fully for the first time since entering the room, no longer bowing her head out of habit. I have already gotten closer to the truth than anyone else. Let me continue. A faint, almost reluctant smile touched the corner of his mouth, there and gone so quickly she almost thought she had imagined it. Very well, but you will report everything to Alden, without exception, and you will take no unnecessary risks. If you sense danger, you retreat immediately. Do you understand me? Yes, my lord. Good. He turned back to the map on the table, tracing a finger along the corridor that led from the wine cellar to the private chambers of several high-ranking members of his council. Because if I am right about who is behind this, then we are no longer just protecting my life, we are protecting the peace between every pack that will gather here in less than 3 weeks' time. If this plot succeeds, and the packs believe I was murdered by a rival during the summit, the war that follows will cost far more lives than mine alone. Elira left the study that night, with the weight of his words pressing heavily on her chest. She had come to this fortress as a girl with nothing, seeking only steady work and a roof over her head. She had never imagined that she would find herself standing at the center of something so large, so dangerous, that the future of an entire region rested partly in her hands. But as frightening as the thought was, she found something else beneath the fear, something she had not expected. A quiet, steady resolve. She had been dismissed, and doubted more times in the past week than she could easily count, told again and again that her fears were foolish, that a maid's word carried no weight. And yet the truth had proven itself, piece by piece, exactly as she had feared it would. She was done being invisible. She was done being doubted. Whatever it took, she would see this through to the end, for the king's sake, and for the sake of every innocent person who would suffer if the peace this fortress protected was allowed to shatter. 3 weeks remained until the summit. The clock was already ticking, and somewhere within these very walls, a traitor was counting down the same days, waiting patiently for his chance to strike. The days that followed took on a strange new rhythm for Elira, one where every ordinary task became a chance to search for something hidden. She scrubbed floors while listening for footsteps that did not belong. She folded linens while watching which doors opened and closed at odd hours. She had always been an observant person, but now her attention had sharpened into something closer to purpose, and she found she noticed things she would once have walked past without a second glance. It was during one of these ordinary tasks, carrying a tray of tea to the council chamber, that she first laid eyes on Lord Caelan Vray. She had heard his name before, of course. Everyone in the fortress knew the name of the king's senior advisor, a wolf of considerable standing, whose family had served the Ashbourne line for 3 generations. He was known for his sharp mind, his careful counsel, and the quiet influence he held over matters of trade and diplomacy. He was also, Elira noted, as she set the tray down and began pouring cups for the gathered council members, wearing a cloak of very fine, very dark fabric, cut in a style she recognized instantly. It was the same fine cut she had glimpsed on the stranger meeting with the nervous clerk near the wine cellar. Her hands did not shake, though her heart pounded so loudly she was certain someone in the room must hear it. She kept her eyes lowered, her movements slow and practiced, betraying nothing of the realization crashing through her mind. She finished pouring the tea, curtsied, and left the room as quietly as she had entered it, forcing herself to walk at a normal pace, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. She found Alden near the stables an hour later and told him what she had seen, choosing her words carefully, aware of how thin the evidence truly was. A cloak of fine, dark fabric was hardly proof of guilt. Many wolves of high standing dressed similarly, and she had only glimpsed the stranger's clothing, in poor light, on 2 brief occasions. Still, when Alden carried the news to Draven, the king's reaction was immediate and grim. "Lord Caelan," he said quietly, when Elira was brought to him that evening, "has been part of my council since before I took the throne. My father trusted him. I have trusted him." He was silent for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular, and Elira understood that this was not simply a matter of tracking down a stranger anymore. This was a matter of betrayal, cutting far closer to the king's heart than an ordinary conspiracy ever could. "I could be wrong, my lord. It was only a cloak. Many wolves might wear something similar." "Perhaps." Draven's voice was tight with restrained emotion. "But it fits. Caelan has access to every part of this fortress, without question. He has relationships with merchants throughout the region, including those who supply wine for events such as the summit. and he has grown increasingly vocal in recent months about matters he believes I have handled poorly, particularly regarding trade agreements with the southern pacts. You think he wants the throne for himself? I think, Draven said slowly, that if I were removed during the summit, in a way that could easily be blamed on a rival pack, the resulting chaos would leave a great deal of room for someone patient and well-positioned to step into the confusion and claim power under the guise of restoring order. He shook his head, as though trying to dislodge the thought entirely. But I cannot act on a guess, Ilara. Not against a man who has served this pack for as long as I have been alive. I need proof strong enough that no one, not the council, not the visiting pack leaders, not Kaelin himself, could deny it. Finding that proof became Ilira's singular focus over the following days, though she moved with far greater caution than before. If her suspicions about Lord Kaelin were correct, then he was a man of considerable power and influence, someone who would not hesitate to remove any obstacle standing between himself and his goal, including a lowly maid who happened to see too much. She began paying closer attention to Kaelin's movements whenever her duties brought her near enough to observe without suspicion. She noticed that he took frequent walks in the evening, always alone, always toward the older, less used sections of the fortress near the wine cellar and the storage rooms beneath the eastern tower. She noticed that Peter, the nervous clerk, grew increasingly pale and anxious whenever Kaelin passed through the record room, always finding some excuse to leave shortly after. One evening, nearly 10 days before the summit, Ilira followed at a careful distance as Kaelin made his usual walk toward the storage rooms, staying far enough back to remain unseen, ducking into doorways and shadowed alcoves whenever he paused. She watched him unlock a door she had never noticed before, tucked into a corner of the corridor behind a tapestry depicting the founding of the Ashbourne Pack generations earlier. He disappeared inside, and the door closed softly behind him. Ilira's heart raced. She knew she should turn back, that this was exactly the kind of risk the king had warned her against. But the thought of turning away now, so close to whatever truth lay behind that hidden door, was almost unbearable. She waited in the shadows, counting the minutes, until Kaelin emerged nearly a quarter of an hour later, tucking something small into the inner pocket of his cloak before straightening his posture and walking away with the same measured calm he always carried. Once his footsteps had faded completely, Ilira crept forward and tried the door. It was locked. She stood there for a long moment, frustration and fear mixing together in her chest, before deciding there was nothing more to be done that night. She would have to find another way in, or find some other piece of evidence that did not require breaking into a locked room belonging to one of the most powerful wolves in the fortress. She reported everything to Alden the next morning, describing the hidden door, the tapestry that concealed it, the careful way Kaelin had emerged with something tucked into his cloak. Alden's expression grew troubled as he listened. "That corridor leads toward the old wine cellar," he said slowly. "It has not been used in years, not since the current cellar was built closer to the kitchens. If Kaelin has a private room down there, hidden behind a tapestry, it is not something that would appear on any record the steward keeps. Which means it is exactly the kind of place someone might use to hide things they did not want found," Ilira finished. Alden nodded grimly. "I will tell the king. But Ilira, listen to me carefully. If Kaelin truly is behind this, and he has begun noticing that someone is watching him, you are in more danger than you realize. A man planning to remove a king will not hesitate to remove a maid who has become inconvenient." Ilira felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the kitchen fire nearby. She had been so focused on uncovering the truth that she had not fully allowed herself to consider what would happen if the truth discovered her first. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the quiet breathing of the other maids around her, she thought about Kaelin's calm, unreadable face, the careful way he moved through the fortress, as though he owned every shadow within its walls. She thought about the locked door behind the tapestry, and the small object he had tucked so carefully into his cloak, and she thought, with a growing unease she could not quite shake, about how much closer she had come to danger than she had ever intended. 10 days remained until the summit. Whatever Kaelin was hiding behind that locked door, she was now certain it held the final piece of proof they needed. She simply had to find a way to reach it before it was too late, and before Kaelin realized just how much she had already seen. Alden brought word to the king within the hour, and by midday Ilira found herself once again standing in the private study, though this time she was not alone. A guard captain named Godric had been called in as well, a solid, weathered wolf who had served under Draven's father before him and was known throughout the fortress for his unshakable loyalty. "You are certain it was Kaelin you followed," Godric said, his tone not unkind but careful, the way a man speaks when the stakes of being wrong are very high. "As certain as I can be without seeing his face in full light, sir," Elira answered honestly. "But the cloak, the timing, the hidden door, it all fits together too well to be coincidence." Draven paced slowly along the length of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression tight with the particular strain of a man forced to consider betrayal from someone he had trusted for years. "If we confront him directly, and we are wrong, we destroy the reputation of a man who has served this pack faithfully for decades, and we hand real conspirators, if there are others, the warning they need to cover their tracks completely. If we wait too long, and we are right, the summit arrives before we have stopped him." "Then we need to see inside that room ourselves," Godric said, quietly, "before he suspects we know anything at all." It was decided, after careful discussion, that Elira would be the one to attempt it. Godric argued against it at first, insisting a trained guard would be safer, but Draven pointed out what Elira herself already understood. A guard moving through that corridor would draw immediate suspicion. A maid, carrying linens or cleaning supplies, moving through halls she was expected to clean, would not. "I do not like sending you into danger," Draven said, once Godric had left to organize a distraction that would draw Kaelin's attention elsewhere for the evening. His voice had lost some of its formal distance, and for a moment, Elira saw something almost like genuine concern in his stormy eyes. "You did not ask for any of this. You simply happened to overhear something you should never have heard, and now I am asking you to walk directly toward the danger you tried so hard to warn me about." "I chose to keep going, my lord," Elira said quietly. "No one forced me to follow Lord Kaelin that night, or to keep watching him after. I could have stopped the moment Beta Corwin dismissed me. I did not, because I could not bear the thought of staying silent while something terrible happened that I might have prevented." She met his eyes, steadier now than she had ever imagined she could be in his presence. "I will be careful, my lord. I promise you that." That evening, as the fortress settled into its usual quiet rhythm after supper, Godric arranged for Kaelin to be summoned to a council meeting concerning trade routes for the upcoming summit, a meeting that would keep him occupied for at least an hour. The moment word came that Kaelin had entered the council chamber, Elira made her way toward the old corridor behind the tapestry, a small ring of tools tucked into her apron pocket that Alden had procured from the fortress locksmith, along with hurried instructions on how to use them. Her hands trembled as she worked the lock, the corridor eerily silent around her, lit only by a single torch flickering in its bracket further down the hall. Every small sound, the settling of old stone, the distant call of a night bird outside a window, sent a fresh jolt of fear through her chest. She had never done anything like this before, and the fear of being caught pressed heavily against her resolve. Finally, with a soft click, the lock gave way. The room beyond was small, windowless, lit only by the faint torchlight spilling in from the hallway. Elira stepped inside carefully, closing the door most of the way behind her to avoid drawing attention, and looked around at what Lord Kaelin had been hiding. There was a small writing desk against one wall, covered with papers she did not have time to read carefully. There was a locked chest in one corner, and on a shelf above the desk, carefully arranged, sat several small glass vials, filled with a dark, cloudy liquid, along with a folded letter, bearing a wax seal she did not recognize, marked with the sigil of a pack she had never seen before, one that did not belong to any of the territories she knew to be attending the summit. Her breath caught. She reached for the letter with careful, trembling fingers, unfolding it just enough to read the first few lines, written in the same careful hand as the altered ledger entries she had discovered weeks before. "The wine will arrive as arranged. Once the deed is done, blame will fall upon the visitors from the mountain packs, whose sigil we have already prepared to leave behind. The throne will pass to those who deserve it more than a king who has grown too soft to hold his father's legacy." Elira's blood ran cold. This was not simply proof of a plot against the king's life. This was proof that Kaelin intended to frame an entirely innocent pack for the crime, ensuring that whatever peace existed between the Ashbourne territory and the mountain packs would shatter completely, likely dragging the whole region into war exactly as Draven had feared. She needed to take this letter, needed to bring it directly to the king, but even as the thought formed, she heard something that made her heart stop cold in her chest. Footsteps in the corridor outside, slow and deliberate, growing closer. Illyra barely had time to slip the letter into the folds of her apron before the door swung fully open, and Lord Kalen stood silhouetted in the frame, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to cold, dawning understanding, as his eyes moved from her face to the slightly disturbed items on his shelf. "The little maid who cannot stop asking questions," he said softly, his voice carrying none of the warmth or politeness she had witnessed in the council chamber. His eyes were sharp now, calculating, entirely unlike the careful, composed advisor the rest of the fortress believed him to be. "I confess, I underestimated you. I assumed Corwin's dismissal would be the end of your meddling. Lord Kalen, do not bother with excuses." He stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft, final click that echoed far too loudly in Illyra's ears. "You have seen what I keep in here. That leaves us very little room for pretending otherwise." Illyra's mind raced, searching desperately for some way out, some excuse, some path to safety. But as Kalen advanced slowly across the small room, his expression cold and unreadable, she understood with sudden, terrible clarity that she had walked directly into the danger everyone had warned her about, and there might be no one close enough to help her escape it. Illyra's back pressed against the shelf behind her, the small glass vials rattling softly with the movement. Her mind raced through every possible option, and found almost none that offered any real hope of escape. The room had only one door, and Kalen stood squarely in front of it, his tall frame blocking any path to freedom. "You could have lived a quiet, unremarkable life here," Kalen said, his voice calm, in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have. "Scrubbing floors, folding linens, disappearing into the background, the way servants are meant to. Instead, you decided to make yourself a problem." He took another slow step forward. "I wonder what the king would say if he learned his precious informant broke into a locked room and stole private correspondence. Perhaps he would think you were the traitor all along, planting evidence to turn him against a loyal advisor." "That is not true, and you know it," Illyra said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "I have the letter. Once the king reads it, he will know exactly whose hand wrote those words." Something flickered across Kalen's expression, and for a brief moment, Illyra thought she saw genuine surprise there, as though he had not expected her to be quite so composed in the face of danger. It was quickly replaced by something colder. "Then it seems," he said softly, "that the letter cannot be allowed to leave this room." He moved quickly, faster than she expected from a wolf of his age and bearing, reaching for her before she could react. Illyra twisted away, knocking the shelf behind her, sending one of the glass vials crashing to the stone floor, where it shattered and released a sharp, bitter smell into the air. She used the momentary distraction to duck beneath his outstretched arm and lunge for the door, her fingers closing around the handle just as his grip caught the back of her apron. She heard fabric tear, but it was enough. The apron slipped from around her waist, still clutched in Kalen's hand, but Illyra was already through the door and into the corridor, running as fast as her legs would carry her, the stolen letter still clutched tightly against her chest inside the sleeve of her dress where she had tucked it moments before Kalen entered the room. She did not look back. She could hear Kalen's furious footsteps behind her, closer than she wanted to believe possible, and she pushed herself harder, taking the twisting corridors she knew from years of cleaning this fortress, cutting through a narrow servant's passage that she was certain Kalen, for all his standing, would not know existed. She emerged into the kitchen, startling Ellen and two other maids who were finishing the evening's cleaning, and did not stop to explain, racing instead toward the stairs that led up to the king's private wing. Behind her, she heard Kalen's footsteps falter, then stop entirely, as though he had realized the risk of chasing a screaming, terrified maid through the public halls of the fortress in full view of witnesses. By the time Illyra reached the guards posted outside Draven's chambers, she was gasping for breath, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold out the crumpled letter. "I need to see the king," she managed between ragged breaths. "Now, please, it cannot wait." Something in her voice, or perhaps the sheer desperation written across her face, convinced the guards to act without hesitation. Within moments, she was standing in front of Draven, who took one look at her torn dress and disheveled appearance, and crossed the room in 3 quick strides. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "Lord Kalen," she said, still struggling to catch her breath. "I found his hidden room, my lord. Vials of something, a letter with instructions for the summit. He caught me before I could leave, but I managed to escape with this." She held out the letter, her hand still trembling. Draven took it from her carefully, unfolding it with obvious restraint, as though forcing himself to move slowly despite the urgency of the moment. Illyra watched his face as he read, watched the color drain slowly from his features, replaced by a cold, controlled fury she had not seen from him before. "He means to frame the mountain packs," Draven said quietly, more to himself than to her, his jaw tight with barely contained anger. "He means to kill me and start a war in the same breath." He looked up at her, and something in his expression softened despite the anger still simmering beneath it. "You could have been killed tonight. I was careful, my lord, but not careful enough, it seems. He knows now that I have seen everything." Illyra wrapped her arms around herself, the adrenaline of her escape beginning to fade, leaving a hollow, shaking fear in its place. "He will not simply let this go, not now." "No," Draven agreed grimly, "he will not." He called for Godric immediately, and within minutes, the guard captain arrived, his expression darkening further as Draven explained what had happened and showed him the stolen letter. "We should move on him tonight," Godric said. "Arrest him before he has a chance to destroy any remaining evidence, or flee the fortress entirely. If we arrest him without absolute certainty in front of the full council, and it is discovered later that some detail was wrong, we hand his allies, if he has them, all the justification they need to claim I acted out of paranoia against a loyal servant of this pack," Draven said, though Illyra could see the effort it took him to remain measured, rather than acting purely on the fury she knew he must be feeling. "But you are right that we cannot simply wait either. Not now that he knows Illyra has seen the evidence." It was decided, after tense discussion, that Kalen would be watched closely, but not confronted directly, until they had gathered enough additional proof to make his guilt undeniable before the full council, particularly given how many of its members still trusted him completely. In the meantime, Draven insisted, against Illyra's own protests, that she would no longer sleep in the shared quarters with the other maids. "You will stay in a guarded room near my own chambers until this is resolved," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I will not risk losing you to his desperation now, not after everything you have already sacrificed to bring the truth this far." Illyra wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she did not need special protection, that she was simply a maid who had stumbled into circumstances far beyond her station. But the memory of Kalen's cold, calculating eyes as he advanced toward her in that small hidden room was still too fresh, too frightening, and she found she did not have the strength to refuse the safety he was offering. As she was led to her new quarters that night, exhausted and shaken but alive, she allowed herself, for the first time since this entire ordeal began, a small measure of relief. They had proof now, undeniable proof of Kalen's plot, written in his own hand. Surely, she told herself, the worst of the danger was behind her. She did not yet know how wrong she was. Word of Illyra's confrontation with Lord Kalen could not be kept entirely quiet within the fortress, no matter how carefully Draven and Godric tried to manage it. By the following afternoon, whispers had already begun spreading through the servants' quarters, distorted and exaggerated with each retelling, until the story bore only a distant resemblance to what had actually happened. Sable, a sharp-eyed maid who had worked alongside Illyra for over a year without ever growing particularly close to her, found Illyra in the linen room, sorting through fresh sheets with hands that still trembled slightly from the events of the previous night. "They are saying you accused Lord Kalen of something terrible," Sable said quietly, closing the door behind her, before anyone else could overhear. "Half the staff thinks you have lost your senses entirely. The other half thinks something is being hidden from us, and they are frightened." "What do you think?" Illyra asked, watching Sable's face carefully. Sable was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think Lord Kalen has never once, in all the years I have served in this fortress, looked at any servant as though we were worth more than the dust beneath his boots. And I think a man who looks at people that way is exactly the kind of man capable of the things they are whispering about." Illyra felt something loosen in her chest, a small measure of relief at finding someone willing to believe her, without demanding proof first. It is true, Sable. All of it. He is planning something terrible for the summit, and he nearly caught me discovering the evidence. Sable's expression hardened, and to Alira's surprise, she reached out and gripped her hand firmly. My younger brother worked in Kalen's household for a season, years ago, before I came to serve here. He came home with bruises he refused to explain, and within a month he was dismissed without explanation or payment for his final weeks of work. I never trusted that man, not for one moment, though I never had proof of anything beyond a boy's silence and fear. She met Alira's eyes steadily. If there is anything I can do to help you stop him, I want to help. Alira had not expected an ally, certainly not one who came forward so readily, but she found herself grateful beyond words for the offer. The king and Godric could investigate the council and the fortress's upper halls, but Sable, like Alira herself, moved through the world of servants and staff, a world that saw and heard things the nobility never noticed. Together, over the following days, they began quietly gathering whatever additional information they could. Sable spoke carefully with other servants who had worked in or near Kalen's household over the years, gathering small fragments of stories that, individually, meant little, but together painted a troubling picture of a man who had grown increasingly resentful of Draven's rule, increasingly convinced that the current king lacked the strength and vision his father had once carried. Alira, meanwhile, focused her attention on Peter, the nervous clerk who had first drawn her suspicion weeks earlier. She approached him carefully one afternoon, while delivering fresh ink to the record room, choosing her words gently, aware that a man frightened enough might either break down completely or grow desperate enough to warn Kalen that his secrets were unraveling. "You look tired, Peter," she said simply, setting the ink bottles down on his desk. He glanced up at her, and something in his expression, a kind of hollow, haunted exhaustion, told her he had not slept properly in days. "Do I?" he said flatly, returning his attention to the ledger in front of him. "I know what you have been doing with the delivery records," Alira said quietly, watching his hands still completely over the page. "I do not think you wanted to do it. I think someone gave you very little choice." Peter's face went pale, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, his eyes darting toward the doorway as though checking whether anyone else might overhear. "You do not understand," he finally whispered. "My sister works in his household. He made it very clear what would happen to her if I refused to help him, or if I ever spoke of what I had done." Alira's heart ached at the fear so plainly written across his face. She understood now why he had seemed so nervous, so quick to close his ledger whenever anyone approached. He was not a willing conspirator. He was a frightened man, trapped by threats against someone he loved. "If you help us now, help us stop him before the summit. I believe the king would ensure both you and your sister are protected," she said carefully. "But you must trust us, Peter. Staying silent will not keep her safe forever. Men like Kalen do not simply let go of the people they have used once they no longer need them." It took several more quiet conversations over the following days before Peter finally agreed to speak with Alden directly, providing a detailed account of exactly what Kalen had instructed him to alter in the delivery ledgers, and confirming that additional shipments, unmarked and unaccounted for in any official record, had arrived at the fortress in recent weeks, through the old servants' gate on the eastern side, the very gate closest to the hidden room Alira had discovered. With Peter's testimony added to the stolen letter, the pieces of the conspiracy were finally beginning to form a complete picture, one strong enough, Draven believed, to bring before the full council with confidence. But that confidence was shaken only 2 days later, when Alira returned to her guarded quarters after her evening duties to find the room in disarray, her few personal belongings scattered across the floor, and a single folded note left carefully in the center of her narrow bed. Her hands shook as she unfolded it, and the words written inside, in the same careful hand she had come to recognize with dread, sent ice through her veins. "You have proven more resourceful than I expected. But resourcefulness does not protect against everything. Consider this a final warning. Walk away now, and I will forget you ever existed. Continue, and I promise you, the summit will not be the only tragedy this fortress witnesses in the coming weeks." Alira sat down heavily on the edge of her bed, the note trembling in her grip, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of how much danger she had truly placed herself in. Draven's fury, when he learned of the threatening note, was unlike anything Alira had witnessed from him before. Where he had remained controlled and measured through every previous revelation of Kaelin's betrayal, this time his composure cracked entirely, and for a moment she saw not simply a king wronged by a trusted advisor, but a man terrified for the safety of someone he had come to care for, far more than he had perhaps intended to admit, even to himself. "He threatened you directly," Draven said, pacing the length of his study with barely contained anger, the note crumpled tightly in his fist. "He entered these fortress walls, walked past guards who should have stopped him, and left this in your room, as though he owns every corridor within these stones." "He may not have entered himself, my lord," Godric offered grimly, though his own expression carried little conviction. "He has clearly built a network of frightened or loyal servants, willing to act on his behalf, as we saw with young Peter. It would not have taken much for him to have someone else deliver the note." "It does not matter who carried it," Draven said. "It matters that he is growing desperate, which means he knows how close we are to exposing him, and desperate men are far more dangerous than patient ones." He turned to Alira, and the anger in his eyes softened into something gentler, though no less intense. "I should never have allowed you to continue investigating after that first night in the hidden room. I let my need for proof outweigh your safety, and that was wrong of me." "You did not force me into anything, my lord," Alira said firmly. "I chose to help Peter. I chose to keep searching for answers. If anyone bears responsibility for the risks I have taken, it is Kaelin alone, for choosing betrayal over loyalty in the first place." Despite her steady words, Draven insisted on additional guards stationed directly outside her door from that point forward, and made it clear that she was no longer to move through the fortress alone, under any circumstances. Alira did not argue this time. The fear she had managed to keep at bay through sheer determination was beginning to catch up with her, and she found she was grateful, more than she wanted to admit, for the protection he offered. With less than a week remaining until the summit, the urgency of the situation pressed down on everyone involved. Draven called a private meeting, with only his most trusted advisors, Godric among them, along with 2 other council members whose loyalty had never once wavered in all the years of his rule. A sharp-minded elder named Hannah, who oversaw matters of law and justice within the pack, and a younger councilman named Lucas, who managed relations with the neighboring territories, including the mountain packs Kaelin intended to frame. Alira was invited to attend as well, an honor she understood was unusual, if not entirely unheard of, for someone of her standing. She stood quietly near the back of the room, as Draven laid out everything they had uncovered: the altered ledgers, Peter's testimony, the stolen letter, and now the threatening note left in her own quarters. Hannah listened with the careful, measured attention of someone accustomed to weighing evidence, her expression growing steadily grimmer as the details unfolded. "This is enough to bring formal charges before the full council," she said finally. "More than enough. But I share your earlier concern, Draven. If we move against Kaelin now, before the summit, and any hint of the mountain pack framing reaches ears beyond this room, the visiting delegations may hear rumors before we have the chance to properly explain the truth. Suspicion, once planted, is difficult to fully uproot." "Then we do not move against him before the summit," Lucas said slowly, an idea clearly forming as he spoke. "We let him believe his plan is still intact. We allow the wine to be delivered as arranged, but we ensure it never reaches the king's cup, and we position ourselves to catch him in the act of attempting to carry out the poisoning itself, in front of witnesses who cannot later claim ignorance or doubt." The room fell silent as everyone considered the risk of such a plan. Alira felt her stomach twist at the thought of Draven deliberately placing himself in danger, allowing the very threat she had worked so hard to expose to unfold close enough to actually endanger his life, even with precautions in place. "It is dangerous," Draven admitted, "but Lucas is right. Catching him in the act, before every pack leader gathered for the summit, leaves no room for doubt, no room for his allies within the council to claim he was falsely accused. It ends this completely, in a single stroke, rather than dragging out an investigation that Kaelin's supporters could challenge for months." Alira wanted to object, wanted to insist there had to be a safer path, but she understood, even as the protest rose in her throat, that Draven and his advisors were right. A quiet arrest before the summit risked leaving lingering doubt and division within the council. A public exposure, timed perfectly, would settle the matter beyond question. There is one more piece we need, Godric said, studying the letter once more. This mentions the mountain pack sigil being prepared to leave behind as false evidence. If we can locate that sigil, and catch Kalen either placing it or in possession of it at the moment of the poisoning attempt, there will be absolutely no doubt remaining, even among his most loyal supporters. The room turned toward Alira, and she understood, with a mixture of dread and determination, exactly what they were about to ask of her. "You want me to go back into that hidden room," she said quietly. "Not alone this time," Draven said firmly, before anyone else could speak. "And not until the night of the summit itself, when Kalen will be occupied elsewhere, overseeing the final preparations he believes will secure his victory. Godric will accompany you. I will not risk you facing him alone again." Alira nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the plan settle over her, heavy but clear. 6 days remained until the summit began. 6 days to prepare for a confrontation that would either expose Kalen's treachery completely before the eyes of every gathered pack leader, or, if anything went wrong, plunge the entire region into exactly the kind of devastating war he had been so carefully engineering all along. She thought of Peter's trembling hands, of his sister still living under Kalen's roof, of Sable's quiet fury at a man who had hurt her brother years before, of the fear in her own chest, each time she remembered his cold, calculating eyes in that hidden room. Whatever came next, she understood, there was no path left that did not run directly toward danger. She only hoped, as the meeting ended and the small group of conspirators against a much larger conspiracy dispersed into the quiet fortress night, that they had prepared enough to survive it. The days leading up to the summit passed in a strange blur of ordinary activity, layered over quiet, careful preparation. On the surface, the fortress buzzed with the usual excitement of hosting such a significant gathering, banners raised along the outer walls, extra provisions arriving daily, rooms prepared for the arrival of pack leaders and their attendants from across the region. Beneath that surface, Draven and his small circle of trusted allies worked carefully to ensure that when the moment came, nothing would be left to chance. Alira found herself pulled into the preparations in ways she never could have imagined only a month earlier. She helped Godric memorize the layout of the hidden room and the corridor leading to it, sketching rough diagrams from memory to ensure he would move through the space with confidence, even in poor light. She met quietly with Peter twice more, confirming the timing of when the altered wine shipment was expected to arrive, and ensuring his sister had been quietly moved to a protected household within the fortress, under the guise of temporary staff reassignment, safely beyond Kalen's reach, before he could use her as leverage again. Sable, meanwhile, worked to keep watch on the general mood among the serving staff, alert for any sign that word of the plot had leaked beyond their small circle, or that Kalen had grown suspicious that his plans were being quietly unraveled from within his own household staff. Draven himself grew quieter as the summit approached, though Alira noticed he sought her out more often during the evenings, ostensibly to review details of the plan, though their conversations frequently drifted beyond the immediate danger they faced. "My father used to say that a king's greatest weakness is surrounding himself with people who tell him only what he wants to hear," he told her one evening, as they stood together on a quiet balcony, overlooking the courtyard below, watching workers hang the last of the ceremonial banners, in preparation for the arriving delegations. "I always believed I had avoided that mistake. Kalen never simply agreed with me. He challenged my decisions, pushed back against plans he thought were unwise. I mistook that for honesty." "Perhaps it was honesty, at first," Alira offered gently. "People can change, my lord. Resentment can grow slowly, over years, until it becomes something far darker than simple disagreement." Draven was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the courtyard below without truly seeing it. "You have shown me more honesty in a month than he offered me in years of counsel, and you owed me nothing at all. You could have walked away the moment Corwin dismissed you. No one would have blamed you for it. I could not have lived with myself if something happened to you and I had said nothing," Alira admitted quietly. "I still cannot fully explain why it mattered so much to me. I barely knew you then. I only knew that what I heard felt wrong, and that staying silent felt like a betrayal of something larger than myself." He turned to look at her then, and something passed between them in the quiet evening air. Something neither of them had spoken aloud, but which had been growing steadily since that first night in his study, when he had chosen to believe a maid no one else would listen to. "Whatever happens at the summit," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I see you, Illyra Voss. Not as a servant, not simply as someone useful to my investigation. I see you clearly. And what I see, I have come to value more than I expected." Illyra felt warmth rise to her cheeks, unfamiliar and overwhelming amid the tension of everything else weighing on her mind. She did not know how to respond to words like that, not from a king, not from anyone who held such power over her circumstances, and yet the sincerity in his voice left no room for doubt about how genuinely he meant them. "We should focus on the summit first," she said softly, though she could not entirely keep the smile from her voice. "There will be time for everything else once Kaelin has been stopped." "Agreed," Draven said, though the look he gave her suggested he had no intention of letting the matter drop entirely once the danger had passed. The following morning brought the first arrivals, delegations from the coastal territories, followed swiftly by representatives from the northern packs, each greeted with the careful formality expected of such gatherings. Illyra watched from a respectful distance as Draven welcomed each delegation personally, his composure giving no hint of the danger he knew was approaching, nor the careful trap being prepared to catch it. Lord Kaelin, too, played his role flawlessly, moving among the gathered nobles with practiced charm, offering counsel and hospitality, with the same steady confidence he always carried. Watching him, Illyra found it almost impossible to believe this was the same man who had cornered her in that hidden room only days earlier, cold and threatening. It was a chilling reminder of exactly how dangerous he truly was, capable of hiding such profound treachery behind a mask of perfect composure. By the final evening before the summit's opening ceremony, the fortress was full to capacity. Delegations from every neighboring pack settled into their quarters, the wine cellars stocked with the finest vintages the region had to offer, including, Illyra knew with a knot of dread in her stomach, the specific shipment that Kaelin had so carefully arranged. That night, as the fortress finally quieted after a long day of formal greetings and ceremonial preparations, Godric found Illyra waiting near the servants' entrance to the eastern corridor, dressed simply, her expression set with grim determination. "Tomorrow night, during the opening feast, is when he will make his move," Godric said quietly. "The king will drink first, as tradition demands, to honor the visiting delegations. If Kaelin intends to poison that cup, it must happen sometime during the preparations beforehand, likely in the wine cellar itself, before the cup ever reaches the feast hall." "Then that is where we need to be," Illyra said, steadying herself against the fear rising in her chest. Godric nodded grimly. "Tomorrow, Illyra. Everything we have worked toward comes to its end, one way or another. Are you certain you are prepared for what that might mean?" Illyra thought of Peter's frightened eyes, of Sable's quiet fury, of the letter still hidden safely in Draven's private study, of the king's soft words on the balcony only nights before. She thought of everything she had risked, and everything that remained at stake if they failed now, so close to the truth finally being revealed. "I am ready," she said, and for the first time in weeks, she found she truly believed it. The opening feast of the summit began exactly as tradition demanded, with the great hall filled to overflowing, long tables set with the finest dishes the fortress kitchens could offer, and every pack leader from the surrounding territories seated according to careful protocol, their attendants standing watchfully behind them. Illyra, dressed once again in her simple maid's uniform, moved among the serving staff carrying trays of food, her eyes constantly tracking toward the doorway that led down to the wine cellar, where Godric had positioned himself hours earlier, waiting. The plan was simple in theory, though every part of Illyra's body hummed with tension as the evening progressed. Godric would watch the cellar closely, ready to intervene the moment Kaelin attempted to tamper with the ceremonial cup reserved for the king's opening toast. Illyra's role was to remain near the great hall, watching for any sign of Kaelin slipping away from the gathered nobles at the critical moment, ready to alert Draven immediately if their carefully laid plan needed to shift. For nearly an hour, everything proceeded normally. Kaelin moved among the visiting delegations with his usual practiced ease, offering warm greetings to the mountain pack representatives, with no outward hint of the betrayal he had planned against them. Illyra watched him carefully from across the hall, her heart hammering every time he paused to speak with someone new, wondering if this would be the moment he slipped away toward the cellar. It was Draven himself who finally rose from his seat at the head table, lifting his hand for silence, as the hall gradually quieted, in anticipation of the traditional opening toast. Servants began moving forward with the ceremonial pitcher of wine, and Alira felt her stomach drop as she realized the moment had nearly arrived, and Kaelin was still standing calmly among the crowd, showing no sign of moving toward the cellar at all. Something was wrong. He was not where they expected him to be. She caught sight of Sable across the hall, and the alarm on her fellow maid's face confirmed what Alira had already begun to fear. Their plan had accounted for Kaelin moving to tamper with the wine himself. It had not accounted for the possibility that he might have already ensured the poison was in place long before tonight, perhaps hidden within the ceremonial pitcher itself, rather than added at the last possible moment, meaning Godric's careful watch over the cellar entrance would catch nothing at all. Alira did not have time to think through every possibility. She moved quickly through the crowd, weaving between nobles and servants alike, reaching the head table, just as the ceremonial cup was being filled and placed before Draven, who lifted it with the composed dignity expected of an alpha king, about to honor his guests. "My lord, wait," she said, breathless, drawing startled glances from the nearest nobles as she pushed forward, ignoring every rule of protocol that would normally have kept a maid far from such a moment. Draven's eyes met hers across the table, and something in her expression must have conveyed the urgency she felt, because he lowered the cup slightly without drinking, his sharp gaze already scanning the crowd for the danger she had clearly come to warn him about. "Kaelin is not near the cellar," Alira said quickly, her voice pitched low enough that only those closest could hear, though the sudden hush spreading across the hall told her their exchange had already drawn far too much attention. "He never intended to tamper with the wine tonight, my lord. It must already have been done, before it ever reached this hall." A murmur of confusion and alarm rippled through the gathered delegations, and Alira felt every eye in the room turning toward her, a lowly maid who had just interrupted the most sacred tradition of the summit's opening ceremony. She saw Kaelin's face across the hall, and for just a moment, something flickered behind his carefully composed expression, a flash of genuine alarm that confirmed everything she had just said. "This is absurd," Kaelin said loudly, stepping forward with practiced outrage, drawing the attention of the nearest pack leaders. "My lord, surely you will not allow a servant's baseless panic to disrupt the sacred traditions of this gathering. Perhaps the poor girl has simply had too much excitement for one evening." "Perhaps," Draven said evenly, his eyes never leaving Kaelin's face. "Or perhaps she has simply seen more than you intended anyone to see, Kaelin." The color drained visibly from Kaelin's face, though he recovered quickly, forcing a laugh that fooled no one who was watching closely. "My lord, I do not understand." "I think you understand perfectly well." Draven set the untouched cup down carefully on the table before him and gestured toward Godric, who had emerged from the cellar doorway at the sound of the commotion, along with two additional guards carrying a small locked chest Alira recognized instantly from the hidden room behind the tapestry. "While you have been enjoying this evening's festivities, my guards have been securing evidence of a conspiracy against my life. Evidence that includes a letter written in your own hand, detailing your intention to poison me tonight and place blame upon our honored guests from the mountain territories." The hall erupted into stunned murmurs, and Alira watched as every eye turned toward Kaelin, whose careful mask of composure finally cracked entirely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "You cannot possibly believe the word of a maid over the counsel of a man who has served this pack faithfully for 30 years, Kaelin said, his voice rising now, edged with genuine desperation. "I do not believe her word alone," Draven said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "I believe the letter in your own handwriting. I believe the clerk you threatened into altering delivery records. I believe the mountain pack sigil my guards found hidden in that chest, prepared to be left behind as false evidence of their guilt." He stepped around the table slowly, his presence commanding despite his measured pace. "You nearly succeeded, Kaelin. If not for a maid brave enough to speak up when everyone else told her to stay silent, you would have started a war tonight that could have cost thousands of lives, all to satisfy your own hunger for power." The mountain pack leader, an older woman with sharp, watchful eyes, rose slowly from her seat, her expression thunderous, as the full weight of what had nearly happened settled over the hall. "You intended to see my people blamed for murder," she said, her voice cold with fury. "You intended to see our territories dragged into war based on a lie." "I intended," Kaelin said, his composure finally shattering completely. to save this pack from a king too weak to hold what his father built. Draven softens our borders, extends trust where his father would have shown strength, and I watched, year after year, as our influence weakened, while he entertained peace with territories that once feared us. His eyes were wild now, all pretense abandoned. Someone had to act before it was too late. And instead, Draven said quietly, you very nearly plunged this entire region into exactly the kind of destruction you claimed to be preventing. He gestured to the guards standing ready near the hall's entrance. Take him. He will answer for his crimes before the full council, with every gathered pack leader as witness to the truth. As guards moved forward to restrain the struggling, furious Kaelin, Alira felt her legs finally give way to the exhaustion and terror of the past hour, and she found herself steadied by a strong hand at her elbow. She looked up to find Draven beside her, his expression a mixture of relief and something far warmer that he no longer seemed to be hiding in front of the entire assembled summit. You saved my life tonight, he said quietly, for her ears alone. Again. I only did what anyone should have done from the beginning, Alira said, still trembling slightly. I simply refused to stop, even when everyone told me to. Around them, the hall slowly began to settle from its shock into something closer to relieved understanding, as pack leaders, who had arrived as cautious allies, began to grasp just how close they had all come to a catastrophe. None of them would have survived unscathed. And at the center of it all stood Alira, the maid no one had believed, finally seen for exactly what she truly was. In the days that followed, the fortress slowly returned to a kind of order, though nothing about it felt entirely the same as before. Lord Kaelin was held under close guard while the full council reviewed the evidence against him, and though the process was formal and thorough, there was little doubt remaining among anyone who had witnessed his outburst in the Great Hall about where the truth truly lay. Peter's testimony, given now without fear since his sister remained safely protected, along with the letter in Kaelin's own hand and the mountain pack sigil discovered in his hidden chest, left no room for the council to reach any conclusion other than the one everyone already understood to be true. The mountain pack leader, whose fury on the night of the feast had been entirely justified, remained at the fortress longer than originally planned, working closely with Draven to ensure that the alliance between their territories emerged from this crisis stronger rather than weakened by suspicion. It was a delicate process, but one that Draven approached with the same steady wisdom Alira had come to admire in him, careful never to let the near catastrophe become an excuse for anger, to fester where trust could instead be rebuilt. Alira found herself, in the weeks following the summit, in a position she still struggled to fully understand. Word of her role in exposing Kaelin's plot had spread throughout the fortress and beyond, carried by the visiting delegations back to their own territories, until she had become something of a quiet legend among both the servants and the nobility, the maid who refused to stay silent, even when the most powerful men in the fortress told her she was wrong. She continued her work for a time out of simple habit, uncertain how else to occupy herself, though she noticed the way people looked at her differently now, with a respect that had never once been extended to her before. Beta Corwin, who had dismissed her so readily on that very first night, sought her out privately, to offer an apology she had never expected to receive. I was wrong to dismiss you so quickly, he said, his usual gruff confidence tempered by genuine humility. I have served this pack for many years, and I let my assumptions about what a maid could or could not know blind me to the possibility that you had seen something real. I am sorry for that, and I am grateful, more than I can properly express, that you did not let my dismissal stop you from continuing to seek the truth. Alira accepted his apology graciously, though she found she carried no real bitterness toward him. He had, after all, been acting on the same assumptions that most of the fortress held about servants like her, assumptions she understood now would take far longer than a single conversation to fully change. It was Draven, however, who offered her the change that mattered most. He summoned her to his study one evening, weeks after the summit had concluded and the last of the visiting delegations had departed, and she found him standing once again by the same window where their strange, unlikely partnership had first begun. I have spoken with the council, he said, turning to face her with an expression she could not quite read. They have agreed, with remarkably little resistance given the circumstances, that a position should be created within my household, an advisor, whose role is to serve as a bridge between the concerns of the staff and the decisions made by the council. Someone who understands what it means to be overlooked, and who has proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that such perspectives carry more value than this fortress has ever properly acknowledged. Alira stared at him, uncertain she had understood correctly. "My lord, are you saying?" "I am asking you, Alira Voss, to serve as that advisor," Draven said, his voice steady, despite the warmth clearly beneath it. "Not because you saved my life, though you did, more than once. Because you have proven yourself sharper, braver, and more honest than nearly everyone I have surrounded myself with for years. This fortress needs someone willing to speak difficult truths, even when those truths are unwelcome. I do not believe I could find anyone better suited to that role than you." Tears gathered unexpectedly in Alira's eyes, and she found herself unable to speak for a long moment, overwhelmed by the sheer distance between where she had stood only weeks earlier, dismissed and doubted at every turn, and where she stood now. "I would be honored, my lord," she finally managed. "Draven," he corrected gently, stepping closer. "I think, given everything we have been through together, you have more than earned the right to use my name." "Draven," she repeated softly, and the way he smiled at the sound of it told her this moment meant as much to him as it did to her. In the months that followed, Alira settled into her new role with the same quiet determination that had carried her through every danger she had faced since that first frightening night in the East Tower. She worked closely with Hannah and Lucas, bringing forward concerns from the staff that had never before reached the council's ears. And slowly, steadily, the fortress began to change in small but meaningful ways. Servants treated with greater fairness, grievances addressed rather than dismissed, a quiet culture of listening beginning to take root where indifference had once stood unchallenged. And between Alira and Draven, something else continued to grow as well. Unhurried, but unmistakable. Built on the foundation of trust they had forged together during the most dangerous weeks either of them had ever faced. It was not the kind of connection that needed grand declarations or dramatic gestures. It was steady, patient, and true, much like the courage that had first brought them together. Lord Kaelin's trial concluded with a sentence of permanent exile from Ashbourne territory, his once considerable influence stripped away entirely, his name remembered only as a warning of what happens when ambition is allowed to curdle into betrayal. The Mountain Pack alliance, rather than shattering as he had intended, grew stronger in the aftermath, forged by the shared understanding of how close they had all come to a tragedy none of them would have survived unchanged. And Alira, the maid no one had believed, remained at the center of it all, no longer invisible, no longer doubted, but seen at last for exactly who she had always been, a woman brave enough to speak the truth, even when the whole world told her to stay silent. She had almost been too late, but almost, in the end, had been enough.